Some promises we make as children stay with us forever, carved deep into our hearts like names on old oak trees. There's something pure about a child's love, untainted by the harsh realities that life teaches us along the way. 6-year-old Henry watched mountain woman Isabelle face down 3 armed outlaws threatening their small Colorado mining town. She stood alone against danger, protecting innocent lives with nothing but courage and an old rifle. In that moment, young Henry declared he would marry her when he grew up. 17 years passed. The boy became a man, seasoned by frontier life and skilled with a gun. Now he's returned to honor that childhood promise, expecting to find the same brave woman who captured his heart. Instead, he discovers a town gripped by fear and mysterious disappearances that began the day after he left. What dark secret has Isabelle been hiding in these mountains all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dusty trail wound down from the high country like a weathered ribbon, and Henry Caldwell felt every mile of those 17 years in his bones as Cedar Ridge came into view. The town spread before him in the valley below, smaller than his memories had painted it, more fragile somehow. Smoke rose from fewer chimneys than he remembered, and several buildings stood empty, their windows dark as dead eyes. He pulled his horse to a stop at the overlook, where he'd said goodbye to this place as a 6-year-old boy, riding behind his father on their way to start a new life in Kansas. The wooden heart he'd carved for Isabelle still rested in his vest pocket, worn smooth by years of absent-minded handling. Such a simple thing, whittled with a dull knife and a child's determination. He wondered if she'd kept it, or if childhood tokens meant anything to a woman who'd spent nearly 2 decades alone on these mountains. The horse nickered softly, sensing his rider's hesitation. Henry had faced down gunfighters in Dodge City, tracked rustlers through the badlands of New Mexico, and earned a reputation that made grown men step aside when he walked into a saloon. But the thought of seeing Isabelle again, of explaining why it had taken him so long to return, made his hands unsteady on the reins. Cedar Ridge had been a thriving mining community when he left, bustling with the promise of silver in the mountains, and families building lives around that hope. Now as he rode down the main street, he counted more boarded storefronts than open ones. The few people he passed moved with their heads down, hurried steps carrying them quickly from one destination to another. No one lingered to chat on street corners. No children played in the dusty road. The Miners' Rest Saloon still operated, though its paint had faded and the bat-wing doors hung slightly crooked. Henry tied his horse to the hitching post and stepped inside, his spurs chiming softly against the wooden floors. The bartender, a grizzled man with silver whiskers, looked up with the practiced wariness of someone who'd seen too many strangers bring trouble. "Whiskey," Henry said, placing a silver dollar on the scarred bar top. "You just passing through?" The bartender asked as he poured. "Returning, actually. I grew up here. Left when I was 6. The man's weathered face showed a flicker of recognition. "You wouldn't be Henry Caldwell, would you?" "Old Tom Caldwell's boy?" "That's right. Well, I'll be damned." The bartender extended a calloused hand. "Name's Pete Morrison. I remember when your daddy brought you around to say goodbye to folks. You were just a little fella then, but you had those same green eyes." Henry shook his hand, grateful for the warm reception. "Good to meet you, Pete. Though I have to say, the town looks different than I remembered." Pete's expression darkened. "Yeah, well, times have been hard, real hard. Lost our mine foreman last month, and 2 good families before that. People are scared, Henry. Scared enough that most are talking about packing up and leaving for good. What happened to them? That's the thing, nobody knows. They just up and disappeared. No trace, no signs of struggle, nothing. One day they're here, next day they're gone like they never existed at all." Pete leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Some folks think it's got something to do with the mountain woman." Henry's pulse quickened. "Isabelle? You know her?" Pete's eyes widened. "Most people around here give her a wide berth. She comes down to town maybe once a month for supplies, keeps to herself up in that cabin of hers. Strange things seem to follow in her wake, if you catch my meaning. Before Henry could respond, the saloon doors swung open and Sheriff Coleman stepped inside. The lawman had aged considerably since Henry's childhood memories of him. His hair had gone completely white, and deep lines etched his face like a map of hard years. But his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him respected throughout the territory. "Pete, who's the stranger?" Coleman asked, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. "No stranger, Sheriff. This here's Henry Caldwell, Tom's boy, all grown up." Coleman's stern expression melted into surprise, then genuine warmth. "Henry, my God, look at you. Last time I saw you, you barely came up to my belt buckle." He clasped Henry's shoulder with a firm grip. "What brings you back to Cedar Ridge after all these years?" Henry chose his words carefully. "Unfinished business, you might say. I made a promise before I left." The sheriff's knowing smile suggested he understood more than he let on. "Ah, yes, that promise. I remember a certain 6-year-old boy declaring his intentions rather boldly to anyone who'd listen." His expression grew serious. "Though I have to wonder about your timing. This isn't the safest place to be right now, so I've been hearing." "Pete was telling me about the disappearances." Coleman nodded grimly. 3 good people gone in the past month. Martha Henderson, who ran the boarding house. Young Samuel Curtis, who worked the assay office. And just last week, Jim Walsh, our mine foreman. No bodies, no signs of violence, no tracks leading anywhere. They just vanished. Any theories?" "Plenty of theories. Not much in the way of facts." Coleman accepted a whiskey from Pete and downed it quickly. "Some folks blame outlaws, though no outlaw gang I know operates like this. Others think it might be wild animals, but we haven't found so much as a scrap of clothing. And then there are those who whisper about more. Unusual explanations. The mountain woman?" Henry asked. Coleman's eyes sharpened. "You planning to pay Isabelle a visit?" "I am. Well, I can't stop you, but I'd advise caution. She's not the same woman you knew as a child, Henry. Life up in those mountains changes a person, makes them hard, secretive. And the timing of these disappearances," he shook his head. "Let's just say it's got people talking." Henry finished his whiskey and placed another $1 on the bar. "Where can I find lodging for the night?" "Mrs. Patterson runs a small boarding house 2 streets over," Pete said. "Clean beds, decent meals. Though she might ask you a lot of questions, not many strangers come through anymore." As Henry prepared to leave, Coleman caught his arm. "Henry, I hope you find what you're looking for. But be careful. This town has lost enough good people already." Walking through the dusty streets toward the boarding house, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that eyes were watching him from behind curtained windows. The few people he encountered averted their gazes quickly, hurrying about their business with the nervous energy of prey animals sensing a predator nearby. Mrs. Patterson proved to be a thin, nervous woman in her 50s, who indeed peppered him with questions while showing him to a sparse but clean room. She spoke in hushed tones about the missing people, crossing herself when she mentioned their names, and warned him against venturing into the mountains after dark. "It's not natural." "What's been happening?" she whispered as she handed him a key. 3 families have already packed up and left for Denver. Can't say I blame them. When folks start disappearing into thin air, it's time to find a new place to call home." That evening, Henry sat on the boarding house porch, watching the sun set behind the mountain peaks. Somewhere up in those shadows and pine trees, Isabelle was living her solitary life, perhaps unaware that the boy who'd promised to marry her had finally returned. The wooden heart in his pocket seemed to pulse with its own weight, a tangible reminder of innocent intentions and the complicated realities that awaited their fulfillment. A cool wind swept down from the mountains, carrying with it the scent of pine and something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. In the distance a wolf howled, the sound echoing off the rocky peaks before fading into the gathering darkness. Tomorrow he would begin the journey up the mountain to find Isabelle. Tonight he would try to reconcile the woman she'd become with the brave, kind-hearted person who'd captured a child's heart 17 years ago. The town's fear was palpable, pressing against him like a physical weight, but Henry had made a promise, and promises, especially those made in childhood innocence, deserved to be kept. The first stars appeared in the darkening sky as Henry retired to his room, the wooden heart safe in his pocket and questions multiplying in his mind. Tomorrow would bring answers, he hoped. Tonight brought only the whisper of mountain wind and the growing certainty that Cedar Ridge's troubles ran deeper than simple disappearances. Whatever had changed Isabelle, whatever dark secret the mountains were hiding, Henry would face it. Some promises were worth keeping, no matter what shadows they led you into. Henry woke before dawn to the sound of commotion in the street below. Voices carried through the thin walls of the boarding house, urgent, frightened voices that pulled him from restless sleep. He dressed quickly and stepped onto the porch to find a small crowd gathered around Sheriff Coleman, their faces pale in the early morning light. "What's happened?" Henry asked Pete Morrison, who stood at the edge of the group. "Another one's gone missing," Pete whispered. "Old Doc Henley." His wife found his bed empty this morning, front door standing wide open. No sign of where he went or why. Henry pushed through the crowd to reach Coleman, who looked like he'd aged another 10 years overnight. The sheriff held something in his weathered hands, a brass compass that caught the morning sunlight with an odd, unsettling gleam. "Found this by his front step," Coleman said, noticing Henry's approach. "Strangest damn thing I've ever seen." Henry examined the compass without touching it. The needle didn't point north as it should have, but instead swung steadily toward the mountains, toward the high peaks where Isabelle made her home. More disturbing still, dark stains marked the brass casing, stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. "Has anyone checked on Doc Henley's usual patients?" Henry asked. "Maybe he got called out for an emergency. First thing we thought of," Coleman replied. "But nobody in town called for him, and there's no sick folks up in the mining camps. Besides, Doc always took his medical bag when he went on calls. The bag's still sitting on his kitchen table, instruments clean and ready for use." Mrs. Patterson pushed through the crowd, her thin face drawn with worry. "This makes 4 people in 5 weeks, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. 4 good souls just vanished into nothing. What kind of evil takes people from their beds in the middle of the night?" "The kind that needs to be stopped," Henry said firmly. He looked at Coleman. "I'd like to take a look at Doc Henley's house, if you don't mind." "I was hoping you'd offer," the sheriff replied. "Fresh eyes might see something I missed." Doc Henley's small house sat at the end of Main Street, closest to the mountain trail. Henry walked through each room slowly, looking for anything out of place. The bed showed signs of someone rising quickly, covers thrown back, pillow still indented. A half-eaten supper sat on the kitchen table, fork laid beside it as if the doctor had been interrupted mid-bite. But it was in the front room that Henry found something truly unsettling. Scratched into the wooden floor near the door were symbols he didn't recognize, angular marks that seemed to writhe and shift when he looked at them directly. The scratches were fresh, made with something sharp and deliberate. "Sheriff," Henry called. "Come look at this." Coleman knelt beside him, studying the strange markings. "Never seen anything like it. Looks almost like writing, but not in any language I know." A shadow fell across the doorway, and both men looked up to see Isabelle silhouetted against the morning sun. Henry's breath caught in his throat. She was still beautiful, but 17 years had carved changes into her face that went beyond simple aging. Her dark hair was shot through with premature silver, and her eyes held depths of weariness that spoke of burdens carried too long alone. "Those marks weren't made by human hands," she said quietly, her voice carrying the same melodic quality Henry remembered from childhood, though now it held notes of sadness that made his heart ache. "Isabelle," he managed, rising to his feet. The wooden heart in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest. Her eyes met his for the first time in 17 years, and for a moment he saw a flicker of the woman who had faced down 3 outlaws to protect their town. Then the mask slipped back into place, and she was once again the remote mountain woman the townspeople feared. "You shouldn't have come back." "Henry," she said, "I made a promise. Promises made by children shouldn't bind grown men." She stepped into the room, moving with a fluid grace that reminded Henry of wild things, beautiful but dangerous, ready to flee or fight at a moment's notice. This isn't the same place you left. And I'm not the same woman you remember. Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat. Isabelle, if you know something about these disappearances, now would be the time to share it. She looked at the strange symbols scratched into the floor, and Henry saw her hands tremble slightly before she clasped them behind her back. I know that Doc Henley is beyond your help now. They all are. What do you mean beyond help? Henry demanded. Are they dead? Death would be kinder, she replied, her voice barely audible. She turned to leave, but Henry caught her arm gently. Isabelle, please, talk to me. Help me understand what's happening here. For a moment, her composure cracked, and he saw the frightened woman beneath the cold exterior. You don't understand, Henry. You can't understand. Some things are better left buried in the mountains where they belong. She pulled away from his grasp and walked toward the door, but before she could leave, a new commotion erupted in the street outside. Shouts and running footsteps drew all three of them to the doorway, where they saw Pete Morrison sprinting toward them, his face flushed with exertion and terror. Sheriff, Pete gasped. Come quick. It's happening again, right now. They followed Pete to the general store, where a small crowd had gathered around the building's side wall. There, scratched into the wooden siding in the same angular script they'd found in Doc Henley's house, fresh symbols appeared before their eyes. An invisible hand seemed to be carving them into the wood, each mark appearing with a soft scraping sound that raised goosebumps along Henry's arms. The townspeople stepped back in collective fear as the scratching stopped. In the sudden silence, they could hear something else, a low humming sound that seemed to come from the direction of the mountains, rising and falling like a distant song. What in God's name? Coleman whispered. Isabelle stood frozen, staring at the fresh markings. Her face had gone pale as winter snow. It's calling them, she said. Marking them. They have maybe an hour before. She stopped herself, pressing her lips together as if she'd already said too much. Before what? Henry pressed. Isabelle, if you know what's happening, you have to tell us. People are dying. She turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw a depth of pain that made his chest tighten. No, Henry, people are not dying. Death is what they're hoping for now. Before anyone could respond, she walked away with swift, determined steps, heading toward the mountain trail. Henry started to follow, but she called back without turning around. Don't come looking for me, Henry Caldwell. Some promises are meant to be broken. He watched her disappear into the pine trees, the strange humming from the mountains growing louder as she climbed the trail. The compass in Coleman's hands spun wildly now, its needle jerking back and forth before finally settling on a direction, directly toward Isabelle's retreating form. What do you make of all this? Coleman asked. Henry studied the fresh symbols carved into the store's wall, his mind racing. Whatever was happening in Cedar Ridge, Isabelle was connected to it somehow. But the woman he'd seen today wasn't a killer or a monster. She was someone carrying a terrible burden, someone who'd been fighting alone for far too long. I think, Henry said slowly, that the woman I came here to marry is in more trouble than she's willing to admit. And I think those missing people might still be alive somewhere. The compass continued to point toward the mountains as the humming sound faded into the whisper of wind through pine trees. 4 people had vanished. Strange symbols appeared from nowhere, and the only person who seemed to understand what was happening had just walked away from him. But Henry had made a promise 17 years ago, and promises, even those that led into darkness, deserved to be kept. Tomorrow he would follow that mountain trail, whether Isabelle wanted him to or not. Some burdens were too heavy for one person to carry alone. The afternoon sun slanted through the dusty windows of Sheriff Coleman's office as Henry examined the collection of tarnished badges spread across the desk. Each piece of metal told a story of law enforcement in Cedar Ridge, some dating back 30 years or more, their surfaces worn smooth by time and handling. These belonged to every sheriff and deputy who worked this territory, Coleman explained, his weathered fingers tracing the edge of a particularly old badge. My predecessor, Jake Morrison, Pete's older brother, he collected them, said they were reminders of the men who tried to keep order in wild country. Henry picked up a badge marked with unfamiliar scratches along its edges. What happened to the men who wore these? Most moved on to easier territories. A few died in the line of duty. Outlaws, mining accidents, bar fights. Coleman paused, selecting a badge that looked newer than the others. But 3 of them disappeared under circumstances that sound mighty familiar. The badge Coleman held bore the name Deputy Marshal William Hayes and a date from 22 years earlier. The metal was scratched with the same angular markings they'd seen at Doc Henley's house and the general store. Hayes vanished in 1861, Coleman continued. Left his horse tied outside the saloon and was never seen again. No tracks, no witnesses, nothing but these strange marks carved into the hitching post where his horse waited all night. Henry studied the badge more closely. The scratches weren't random. They formed patterns similar to what they'd witnessed that morning. Were there other disappearances around the same time? 2 more people went missing that same month. Then nothing for nearly 2 decades, until this recent trouble started. Coleman leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. Jake Morrison always suspected the disappearances came in cycles, like some kind of pattern nobody could figure out. What changed your mind about it? Isabelle arrived in town about 6 months after those first disappearances stopped. She was maybe 16, 17 years old, traveling alone with just a pack mule and her grandmother's belongings. Said the old woman had died up in the mountains. Left her instructions to come down and help folks in town when they needed healing. Henry thought about the medicine pouch he'd glimpsed hanging from Isabelle's belt that morning. People trusted her, had to. Doc Henley was just starting his practice then, and Isabelle knew things about mountain herbs and healing that probably saved a dozen lives that first winter. Plus, she never asked for payment, just took what folks could spare and seemed grateful for it. Coleman stood and walked to the window overlooking the main street. But she kept to herself, mostly. Built that cabin up in the high country where her grandmother used to live. Came down to town maybe once a month for supplies. Always polite, always helpful when someone was sick or hurt, but never really part of the community. The townspeople seem afraid of her now. Fear's got a way of twisting memory, Coleman said. When things are going well, folks remember the lives Isabelle saved. When they're scared, they start wondering why a young woman would choose to live alone in the mountains. Why she knows so much about things that aren't in any medical book. Henry walked to the window and looked up at the mountain peaks visible beyond the town's edge. Somewhere up there, Isabelle was living with whatever knowledge she carried about the disappearances. The woman who had once stood between danger and innocent lives now seemed to be running from something far worse than outlaws. Sheriff, I need to ask you something, and I want an honest answer. Go ahead. My father served in the cavalry before he settled here. Did he ever mention anything about these mountains? Anything unusual he might have encountered during his service? Coleman was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on something beyond the window. Your father was a good man, Henry. Honest, brave, the kind of soldier who did his duty no matter what it cost him. But there were things he saw during the Indian Wars that he never talked about. Things that changed him. What kind of things? He arrived in Cedar Ridge about 6 months before you were born, looking for a place to start fresh. Said he'd had enough of fighting and wanted to raise his family somewhere peaceful. But sometimes, late at night when he'd had a few drinks, he'd talk about spirits in the mountains, ancient things that didn't belong in the world of men. Henry felt a chill run down his spine. Did he ever mention making any kind of deal or agreement? Coleman turned from the window, his expression suddenly sharp. Why do you ask that? Something Isabelle said this morning. About promises and things being connected. Henry chose his words carefully. I get the feeling that my return to Cedar Ridge wasn't entirely my own decision. Your father loved you. Henry, whatever he might have done, whatever agreements he might have made, they came from a place of wanting to protect his family. Coleman picked up another badge from the collection, this one unmarked by strange symbols. But love doesn't always make the choices any easier to live with. Before Henry could respond, the office door burst open and Pete Morrison stumbled inside, his face flushed with exertion and excitement. Sheriff, you need to come quick, Pete gasped. We found something up by the old mine shaft. Something that might explain what's been happening to our people. The three men rode hard up the mountain trail, following Pete's lead toward the abandoned silver mine that had once been Cedar Ridge's primary source of prosperity. The mine had played out 5 years earlier, leaving behind a network of tunnels and a community struggling to find new purpose. At the mine entrance, they dismounted and examined what Pete had discovered. Fresh footprints led from the main shaft. Not the prints of miners' boots, but bare feet that seemed too large to be entirely human. The tracks pressed deep into the rocky ground, as if made by someone carrying enormous weight. More disturbing were the symbols carved into the wooden support beams around the mine opening. The same angular script they'd seen in town, but older, weathered by years of mountain storms. Someone, or something, had been using this place long before the recent disappearances began. "There's something else," Pete said, leading them to a pile of personal belongings hidden behind some fallen rocks. "Found these about 20 feet inside the main tunnel." Henry recognized Doc Henley's pocket watch among the items, along with Martha Henderson's distinctive silver hair combs and Samuel Curtis's leather work gloves. The belongings weren't damaged or torn. They appeared to have been carefully removed and set aside, as if their owners had undressed for some ceremonial purpose. "They're alive," Henry said with certainty. "Whatever's happening to these people, they're being taken alive and kept somewhere," Coleman nodded grimly. "The question is where, and for how long?" As they prepared to explore deeper into the mine, a sound echoed from the tunnels below, the same low humming they'd heard in town that morning, but louder now, more insistent. It seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, like a heartbeat amplified through stone and earth. "We should get more men," Pete whispered. Henry checked his gun and stepped toward the tunnel entrance. "We should get Isabelle. She's the only one who seems to understand what we're dealing with." The humming grew louder as they retreated to their horses, and Henry knew that tomorrow he would make the climb to Isabelle's cabin, whether she wanted to see him or not. The badges in Coleman's office represented men who had tried and failed to solve this mystery. Henry intended to succeed where they hadn't, not just for the missing townspeople, but for the frightened woman who was carrying this burden alone. Henry began his ascent to Isabelle's cabin before dawn, following a narrow trail that wound through dense pine forest and over rocky outcroppings. The path showed signs of recent use, but also defensive measures, carefully placed deadfalls that would trap an unwary horse, and subtle markers that warned of hidden snares ahead. The higher he climbed, the more obvious it became that Isabelle had turned her mountain retreat into a fortress. She didn't want visitors, and she'd taken considerable effort to discourage them. But Henry had tracked rustlers through worse terrain, and he recognized the patterns of someone who was protecting rather than attacking. These weren't the traps of a predator. They were the desperate defenses of someone under siege. After 3 hours of careful riding, he caught sight of the cabin tucked into a grove of ancient pines. The structure was larger than he'd expected, built from hand-hewn logs and fitted together with the skill of someone who intended it to last. Gardens surrounded the building, not decorative flowers, but organized rows of herbs and medicinal plants that spoke to serious knowledge of healing arts. What struck Henry most were the symbols carved into trees around the clearing. Unlike the harsh angular markings they'd seen in town, these were flowing, organic shapes that seemed to work with the natural grain of the bark rather than against it. They formed protective circles around the cabin, overlapping patterns that hurt his eyes when he tried to follow them too closely. He was studying one particularly complex symbol when Isabelle's voice came from directly behind him. "You shouldn't have come here." "Henry," he turned slowly, hands away from his weapons. She stood 20 feet away, a rifle cradled in her arms, but not directly threatening. She wore practical mountain clothing, buckskin pants, a wool shirt, sturdy boots, but around her neck hung a leather pouch that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "4 people are missing, Isabelle. Maybe more. I know. Then help me find them." She studied his face for a long moment, and he saw the internal struggle playing out in her expression. You don't understand what you're asking. What you'd be risking by getting involved. Then explain it to me. Something in his tone, perhaps the same determination she'd heard in a 6-year-old boy declaring his intentions, made her lower the rifle slightly. Come inside. But touch nothing without asking, and if I tell you to leave, you go immediately. The cabin's interior surprised him with its combination of frontier practicality and something approaching scholarship. Books lined shelves built into the log walls, medical texts, botanical guides, and volumes in languages Henry couldn't identify. Dried herbs hung from the rafters in carefully organized bundles, and a large table held mortars, pestles, and other implements of the healing arts. But it was the journal lying open on a smaller desk that drew his attention. The pages were covered with handwriting in 2 different scripts, one in English, the other in symbols that seemed to flow across the paper like water. That belonged to my grandmother, Isabelle said, following his gaze. She was Ute, but she learned English from missionaries when she was young. The journal contains everything she knew about the old ways, healing, protection, and the things that live in these mountains that were never meant to walk among men. May I? Isabelle hesitated, then nodded. You'll need to understand if you're going to help them. But Henry, once you know the truth, there's no going back to ignorance. The journal's pages revealed a story that stretched back generations. Isabelle's grandmother had been what the Ute called a medicine woman, but also something more, a guardian tasked with keeping ancient evils contained in the deep places of the mountains. The English portions of the text spoke of entities that fed on human life force, creatures that had once roamed freely until treaties were made and bindings established. She called it the hunger, Isabelle said quietly. It's old, older than the tribes, older than the first white men who came to these mountains. It feeds slowly, carefully, taking only what it needs to survive. But every 20 years or so, it grows strong enough to break free for a short time. Henry read about binding rituals and protective ceremonies, about the price paid by each generation of guardians who kept the entity contained. Your grandmother was one of these guardians, the last of her line, she thought. She trained me in the healing arts, but tried to keep me away from the deeper knowledge. Said the burden had cost her family too much already. Isabelle moved to the window, looking out at the protective symbols carved into the trees. But when she was dying, the hunger began stirring. She had no choice but to pass the binding to me. The binding? Isabelle touched the leather pouch at her throat. A ritual that ties the guardian's life force to the containment. As long as I live and maintain the barriers, the hunger stays locked in the deep caves where it belongs. But the cost, she turned away. I can never leave these mountains, never have a normal life, never marry, Henry finished. The binding requires complete dedication. Any strong emotional attachment weakens it, gives the hunger something to exploit. Her voice carried 17 years of loneliness. I've watched it test the barriers every few years, growing stronger, more cunning. The disappearances aren't random, Henry. It's learning, adapting, finding ways to feed despite the containment. Henry closed the journal carefully. But people are still vanishing. The binding isn't working, it's failing. The admission seemed to cost her great effort. I don't have my grandmother's strength, her deep connection to the old ways. Each time the hunger tests the barriers, I lose a little more ground. The disappearances started small, tentative. Now it's growing bolder. A sound from outside made them both freeze, the low humming they'd heard in town, but closer now, seeming to come from the earth itself. Isabelle's face went pale as she pressed her hand to the medicine pouch. It knows you're here, she whispered. It can sense the connection. What connection? The same one that brought you back after 17 years. The same one that made a 6-year-old boy promise to marry a woman he barely knew. She looked at him with a mixture of fear and something deeper. Henry, your return isn't coincidence. The hunger has been calling to you, using our bond to weaken my defenses. The humming grew louder, and through the cabin windows, they could see the protective symbols on the trees beginning to smoke and char. Whatever force Isabelle had been holding back was growing strong enough to challenge her directly. Then we face it together, Henry said simply. You don't understand. I understand that you've been fighting alone for 17 years. I understand that people are dying because you're not strong enough to hold it back by yourself. And I understand that I made a promise. He stepped closer to her, seeing the fear and hope warring in her eyes. Maybe the hunger is using our connection. But connections work both ways. Maybe it's time to find out what happens when you're not fighting alone. The humming reached a crescendo, then suddenly stopped. In the silence that followed, they could hear something moving through the forest around the cabin. Something large and hungry, testing the weakened barriers for a way inside. The sound of something circling the cabin grew louder as darkness fell. Through the windows, Henry caught glimpses of movement between the trees, shadows that didn't match the wind patterns, shapes that seemed to shift and flow like liquid smoke. Whatever was out there wasn't entirely physical, at least not in any way he understood. Isabelle moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, lighting candles at specific points and murmuring words in her grandmother's language. The medicine pouch at her throat pulsed with a steady, warm light that seemed to push back the encroaching darkness. "Tell me about that," Henry said, nodding toward the pouch. "It contains the binding medallion, the focus for everything that keeps the hunger contained." She paused in her preparations to touch it gently. "My grandmother's grandmother carved it from a stone that fell from the sky back when the first treaties were made with the entity. It's been passed down through 7 generations of guardians. Can I see it?" Isabelle hesitated. "It's not safe for others to handle. The medallion is tied to my life force. If something happened to it while you were touching it, a loud crack from outside cut her off. One of the protective symbols carved into a nearby pine had split completely, the wood smoking as if burned from within. The humming sound resumed, closer now, seeming to come from directly beneath the cabin. "It's testing the barriers more aggressively," Isabelle said, her voice tight with strain. "Your presence here is giving it strength somehow, feeding it the emotional connection it needs to break through." Henry watched her work, noting the way her hands shook as she placed each candle, the lines of exhaustion that marked her face, even in the flickering light. "How long have you been fighting this alone?" "Every day for 17 years. Some days are easier than others, but it never really stops. It whispers sometimes, trying to bargain, promising power or knowledge in exchange for freedom. Other times it rages, throwing itself against the bindings like a caged animal. And you've never had help? Who would believe me? Who would understand?" She completed the circle of candles and moved to a trunk in the corner of the room. "My grandmother had a community. Other medicine women who could share the burden when needed. But the old ways died with her generation. I'm the last." From the trunk, she withdrew items that spoke to generations of guardianship, carved bones inscribed with protective symbols, crystals that seemed to hold their own light, bundles of sage and sweetgrass for cleansing ceremonies. But at the bottom of the trunk lay something that made Henry's breath catch. It was his father's cavalry saber. The blade cleaned and polished, the brass hilt gleaming in the candlelight. "Where did you get that?" he asked. Isabelle lifted the weapon carefully, handling it with obvious reverence. "Your father brought it to my grandmother 3 months before you were born. Said it had been blessed by a military chaplain, carried through battles where good men fought against impossible odds. He asked her to keep it safe until it was needed." Henry reached for the saber, and the moment his fingers touched the hilt, he felt a shock of recognition. Not just the familiar weight of his father's weapon, but something deeper. The steel seemed to vibrate with its own energy, responding to his touch in ways that had nothing to do with mere metallurgy. "He knew," Henry said with sudden understanding. "My father knew what lived in these mountains. That's why he brought this here, why he made whatever arrangement he made." "The cavalry encountered the hunger during the Indian Wars," Isabelle confirmed. "Your father's unit was sent to investigate the disappearance of an entire Ute village. They found the people alive but changed, drained of something essential, existing but not truly living. The humming outside reached a crescendo, and the cabin shook as if something massive had struck the foundation. Several candles flickered, their flames bending toward the windows as if drawn by an outside force. "It's getting stronger," Isabelle said, pressing her hand to the medicine pouch. "The medallion is heating up. I can feel the bindings starting to stretch." Henry drew the saber, surprised by how natural it felt in his grip. The blade seemed to hum with its own frequency, creating a counterpoint to the hungry sound from outside. What did my father agree to? He made a pact. His bloodline would return when the hunger grew too strong for one guardian to contain. In exchange, his family would be protected until that time came. Isabelle met his eyes across the flickering candlelight. "You didn't choose to come back, Henry. You were called." Another crack from outside, louder this time. Through the window, they could see more protective symbols failing. The carved trees splitting and burning despite the mountain's dampness. "Then let's finish what he started," Henry said. Isabelle shook her head. "You don't understand the cost. Fighting the hunger directly means risking your life force, your very soul. It feeds on the essence of living things, and the stronger you are, the more appealing you become as prey. And if we don't fight, everyone in Cedar Ridge dies, drained slowly, until they're empty shells walking around without purpose or joy. Then it moves on to the next settlement, and the next, until it's fed enough to break free of these mountains entirely." The medicine pouch around Isabelle's neck pulsed brighter, and she gasped as if struck by a physical blow. "It's found a weak point in the bindings. I can't—" She stumbled, catching herself against the wall. Henry moved to support her, and the moment he touched her arm, the saber in his other hand blazed with silver light. The humming outside changed pitch, becoming shriller, more urgent. "It doesn't like that," Isabelle observed, straightening with his help. "Then maybe we're on the right track." Henry kept his hand on her shoulder, noting how the contact seemed to stabilize both the saber's light and the pulse of her medallion. "You said emotional connections weaken the binding, but what if they also strengthen other things?" Before she could respond, something struck the cabin wall hard enough to knock books from their shelves. Through the windows they could see shapes moving more boldly now, tall figures that walked like men, but bent and twisted in ways that human joints would never allow. "The missing people," Isabelle whispered. "It's using them as vessels, puppet bodies to test our defenses." Henry raised the saber, its light pushing back the shadows that had begun seeping through the window frames. "Then it's time to get them back." The medallion around Isabelle's throat pulsed in rhythm with the saber's glow, and for the first time in 17 years, she felt the binding strengthen rather than weaken. Whatever connection had brought Henry back to these mountains, whatever force had made a child's promise into destiny, it was more powerful than either the hunger or the ancient guardian bloodline had anticipated. Outside, the twisted figures of the missing townspeople circled closer, but the combined light of saber and medallion held them at bay. The real battle was about to begin. Dawn broke grey and cold over the mountain cabin, revealing the extent of the night's assault. The protective symbols on nearby trees had been systematically destroyed, leaving charred scars in the bark that still smoldered despite the morning dampness. Footprints circled the clearing, some human, others distinctly not, pressed deep into the earth as if made by beings of immense weight. Henry stood at the cabin's front window, his father's saber resting across his palms. In daylight, the weapon appeared unremarkable, except for the unusual warmth it retained, and the way shadows seemed to bend away from its edge. But he remembered the silver fire that had blazed from the steel during the night's siege, and the way the twisted figures of the missing townspeople had recoiled from its light. The chaplain who blessed that blade saw action in the Civil War, Isabelle said, joining him at the window. She looked exhausted, but more at peace than he'd seen her since his return. "Your father told my grandmother that the man had witnessed things during the war that changed his understanding of good and evil. Sacred and profane, what kind of things? Battlefields where the dead wouldn't stay down. Soldiers who came back from the grave with empty eyes and an endless hunger. She touched the medicine pouch at her throat, its pulsing light dimmer now, but still steady. The chaplain learned to bless weapons not just against human enemies, but against things that had never been human at all. Through the trees, they could see movement, the missing townspeople maintaining their vigil around the cabin, but keeping their distance from the combined radiance of saber and medallion. In daylight, their condition was even more disturbing. They moved with jerky, unnatural motions, and their eyes held no recognition of their former lives. "Are they still alive in there?" Henry asked. "Alive, yes, but the hunger has hollowed them out, using their bodies as extensions of its will while it feeds on their life force." Isabelle's voice carried deep sadness. "If we can destroy the entity, they should return to normal. If we can't, we can. We will." Henry secured the saber at his side and turned to face her. "But I need to understand how this works. The connection between us, is it really weakening your defenses?" "I thought it was. 17 years of fighting alone teaches you to see any change as a potential threat." She moved to the journal on her desk, turning pages until she found a passage written in her grandmother's careful English script. "But look at this." Henry read the faded words. "The guardian bloodline was never meant to stand alone against the ancient hungers. The first treaties bound not one, but two lines together, those who watch and those who fight. Together, they were strong enough to contain what should never have been freed. Apart, they can only delay the inevitable." "Two bloodlines," Henry murmured. "Yours and mine." Your father understood. That's why he made his pact, why he ensured you would return when the time was right. Isabelle closed the journal. "The emotional connection between us isn't weakening the binding. It's restoring it to its original strength." A sound from outside drew their attention, not the otherworldly humming of the hunger, but human voices calling through the forest. Through the trees, they could see Sheriff Coleman and a group of townsmen climbing the mountain trail, their faces grim with determination. "They shouldn't be here," Isabelle said. "The hunger will use their fear against them, turn them into more vessels." Henry checked his weapons and moved toward the door. "Then we need to reach them before that happens." They left the cabin together, Isabelle carrying a rifle along with her grandmother's ceremonial items, Henry with his gun belt and the blessed saber. The moment they stepped beyond the protective circle that had surrounded her home, the temperature dropped perceptibly, and their breath began forming clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The missing townspeople, Doc Henley, Martha Henderson, Samuel Curtis, and Jim Walsh, formed a loose perimeter around the approaching rescue party. They moved with predatory purpose now, no longer the jerky puppets of the night before, as if the hunger had learned to control them more efficiently. "Sheriff Coleman!" Henry called out. "Stay back. Don't let them surround you." But the warning came too late. The possessed townspeople had spread out during the night, positioning themselves to trap anyone who might come looking for the missing. Coleman and his men found themselves surrounded by faces they knew, friends and neighbors who regarded them with empty, hungry eyes. "Sweet Jesus," Pete Morrison whispered, recognizing his own nephew among the transformed. "Jimmy boy, it's me. It's your Uncle Pete." The thing wearing Jim Walsh's body tilted its head with unnatural precision, studying Pete with the detached interest of a predator evaluating prey. When it spoke, the voice carried harmonics that made the air itself vibrate. "Uncle Pete," it said, each syllable carefully enunciated. "You came to feed us. How thoughtful." The other possessed townspeople began closing the circle, moving with synchronized purpose that spoke to a single controlling intelligence. Henry could see that Coleman's group had perhaps minutes before they were overwhelmed. "Isabelle," he said quietly, "can you break the entity's control over them? Not from this distance, and not while it's actively directing them." She shouldered her rifle, aiming at the possessed figure of Doc Henley. "But if I can disrupt its concentration—" "No." Henry caught her arm. "We can't risk hitting the real people inside those bodies. Then what do you suggest?" Henry drew the blessed saber, its steel immediately blazing with silver light that made the possessed figures recoil slightly. "We give them something more interesting to focus on." He stepped forward, raising the glowing blade high enough for all the transformed townspeople to see. The effect was immediate. Their synchronized movements faltered, and they turned toward him with expressions of recognition and hunger. "That's right," Henry called out, his voice carrying across the clearing. "I'm what you really want. The bloodline that made the original pact. Come and take me." The possessed figures abandoned their slow encirclement of Coleman's group and began moving toward Henry with increasing speed. Behind them, he could hear the sheriff shouting orders to his men, trying to organize a fighting retreat down the mountain. Isabelle stepped up beside him, the medallion around her throat pulsing in rhythm with the saber's glow. "If we're doing this," she said, "we're doing it together." The Hunger's vessels charged with inhuman speed, but for the first time in 17 years, Isabelle wasn't facing the entity alone. The combined power of guardian and warrior, watcher and fighter, created something neither had possessed separately, the strength to not just contain ancient evil, but to drive it back to where it belonged. The battle in the forest clearing lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. Henry's blessed saber cut through the supernatural influence controlling the possessed townspeople, each strike weakening the Hunger's hold without harming the vessels themselves. Isabelle's medallion pulsed with increasing intensity, creating barriers of light that prevented the entity from simply jumping to new hosts among Coleman's rescue party when the last of the transformed figures collapsed, unconscious, but breathing normally. An eerie silence settled over the mountain. The oppressive cold lifted, and the unnatural shadows that had writhed between the trees faded back to ordinary forest gloom. "Are they?" Coleman began, kneeling beside Doc Henley's still form. "Alive," Isabelle confirmed, checking each of the recovered townspeople. "Exhausted and confused, but alive. The Hunger no longer has direct control over them. Then we've won." Pete Morrison asked, hope creeping into his voice. Henry wiped the saber clean and sheathed it, though he kept his hand on the hilt. "We've won this battle, but the entity itself is still out there, still contained, but not destroyed. And it's learned from this encounter. Next time, it'll be stronger." As Coleman's men organized stretchers for the unconscious townspeople, Isabelle led Henry back toward her cabin. But instead of going inside, she directed him to a small outbuilding he hadn't noticed before, a shed built against the mountainside. Its walls formed partly from living rock. "My grandmother's sanctuary," she explained, producing an ornate key from her medicine pouch. She kept the most dangerous knowledge here, away from casual discovery. The interior of the sanctuary was unlike anything Henry had seen. The walls were covered with maps, genealogical charts, and photographs dating back decades. But what drew his attention was a large daguerreotype mounted prominently on the back wall, a formal, military portrait showing a cavalry officer in dress uniform. Henry stepped closer and felt his breath catch. The face looking back at him from the old photograph was his own, or near enough to be his twin, but the uniform bore insignia he didn't recognize. And written across the bottom in faded ink were the words, "Captain Thomas Caldwell, 3rd Colorado Cavalry, 1863. My father was born in 1842, Henry said slowly. He would have been barely 21 in 1863. Isabelle moved to stand beside him, her expression grave. "That's not your father, Henry. That's your grandfather." She opened a leather portfolio and withdrew additional photographs, documents, and letters that told a story spanning 2 generations. Thomas Caldwell had indeed served with the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, but his military records contained gaps, months-long assignments that were classified even decades later. The Indian Wars weren't just about territorial disputes, Isabelle continued. There were things in the frontier that the government couldn't explain, couldn't control through conventional means. They formed special units, men like your grandfather, who were trained to deal with supernatural threats. Henry studied a letter written in his grandfather's hand, dated November 1863. The careful script described encounters with entities of indigenous origin that prey upon human life force, and detailed negotiations with tribal medicine women to contain these threats. Your grandfather made the original pact, Isabelle said. Not your father. The agreement bound the Caldwell bloodline for 2 generations, his son and his son's son. Your father knew from childhood that his firstborn would eventually be called to fulfill the family obligation. More pieces of the puzzle fell into place as Henry examined the documents. His grandfather had worked directly with Isabelle's great-grandmother to establish the binding rituals that contained the hunger. The 2 bloodlines had been partners from the beginning, their descendants destined to continue the fight when the original guardians grew too old or died. But why didn't my father tell me? Henry asked. Why let me think I was choosing to come back here? Because choice matters, Isabelle replied. The binding requires willing participation. If you'd known you were magically compelled to return, it would have weakened your commitment to the cause. You had to come back of your own free will, driven by genuine emotion rather than supernatural coercion. Henry sank into a chair beside the map table, trying to process the implications. So everything, my childhood promise, my feelings for you, my decision to honor that promise, it was all manipulation? No, Isabelle's voice was firm. The emotions were real. The promise was real. The magic didn't create those feelings. It simply ensured that circumstances would align to bring us together when we were needed. She showed him more photographs, including one that made his heart ache. A young woman who looked remarkably like Isabelle, standing beside Thomas Caldwell in civilian clothes. Both wore expressions of deep affection and shared purpose. Your grandmother, Henry said, my great-grandmother. They loved each other, Henry, just as truly as any couple could. But their duty came first, and when the initial binding was complete, she returned to her people, and he went back to his family in Kansas. They never saw each other again, and now history repeats itself, only if we let it. Isabelle moved to a cabinet and withdrew one final item, a marriage certificate dated December 1863, signed by both Thomas Caldwell and a woman named Ayana, which Isabelle explained meant eternal blossom in her great-grandmother's language. They were married, Henry said in amazement, for 3 months, long enough to ensure the bloodlines would continue, long enough to complete the binding ritual that kept the hunger contained for 60 years. Isabelle's voice carried a note of longing. But then duty called them apart, and they honored their obligations to their respective peoples. Henry stood and walked to the window, looking out at the forest where they'd just battled supernatural evil, using weapons and knowledge passed down through generations. What happens now? Do we finish what they started and then go our separate ways? That depends on what we choose, Isabelle said simply. The old binding is failing because I've been trying to maintain it alone. But if we work together, if we choose to bind our lives as well as our duties, we might be able to create something stronger than what our ancestors built. And the cost? Unknown. We'd be breaking new ground, creating a precedent that doesn't exist in the old treaties. She joined him at the window. But Henry, I've spent 17 years alone on this mountain, carrying a burden that's slowly killing me. If there's a chance, even a small one, that we could share that burden and build a life together, isn't it worth the risk? Through the window, they could see Coleman's men carefully carrying the rescued townspeople down the mountain trail. The immediate crisis was over, but the larger threat remained. Somewhere in the deep caves and hidden places of the mountains, the hunger waited for another opportunity to break free. There's something else you need to know, Isabelle said quietly. The entity has been whispering to me during the quiet moments, trying to bargain for its freedom. It knows about the photographs, the family connections. It's been planning this confrontation for decades. What kind of bargain? Your life in exchange for everyone else's safety. It claims that if it can consume the descendant of Thomas Caldwell, the bloodline that originally bound it, it will have enough power to leave these mountains entirely. Find new territory where no one knows how to contain it. Henry turned from the window to face her. And you considered it for about 5 minutes, until I realized that letting it escape these mountains would just mean more death elsewhere, more innocent people suffering because I was too selfish to do my duty. Her eyes met his. "But Henry, the offer is still open. If something happens to you during the final confrontation, if the entity manages to, it won't," Henry said firmly. "Because we're not fighting this alone anymore. And because some promises, like the one I made when I was 6 years old, are worth keeping no matter what the cost." The hidden daguerreotype seemed to watch them from its place on the wall, a reminder that love and duty had intersected in this place before, with consequences that echoed across generations. Now it was their turn to choose how the story would end. The rescued townspeople were taken to Doc Henley's clinic, where they remained unconscious but stable. Sheriff Coleman posted guards and sent word to neighboring settlements to stay away from Cedar Ridge until the crisis passed. Meanwhile, Henry and Isabelle returned to her cabin to prepare for what they both knew would be the final confrontation. The sanctuary held more secrets than photographs and documents. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, Isabelle retrieved a coil of rope unlike anything Henry had ever seen. The strands weren't made of hemp or cotton, but seemed to be woven from materials that caught and held light in impossible ways. Some threads gleamed like silver, others showed the deep green of living wood, and still others held colors that shifted depending on the angle of view. "The ritual binding rope," Isabelle explained, handling it with obvious reverence. "My great-grandmother spent 3 years gathering the materials, silver blessed by 7 different medicine women, bark from trees that had been struck by lightning but survived, hair from sacred animals that gave their lives willingly for the cause." Henry touched one of the silver strands and felt a shock of energy run through his fingers. "What's it for?" "The final binding ceremony. If we can lure the hunger into physical manifestation, force it to take a single, concentrated form, instead of spreading its influence through multiple vessels, this rope can contain it permanently." She coiled the rope carefully and secured it to her belt. "But the ritual requires both bloodlines working in perfect harmony. One mistake, one moment of doubt or fear, and it will break free stronger than ever." They spent the afternoon going through her grandmother's journal, memorizing the ancient words and gestures required for the binding ceremony. The ritual was complex, requiring precise timing and absolute trust between the participants. Henry would need to maintain physical contact with the entity long enough for Isabelle to complete the binding, while she channeled the combined power of both bloodlines through the medallion and rope. "The entity will try to break our concentration," Isabelle warned as they practiced the ritual movements. "It will show us visions of our fears, our regrets, anything it can use to make us hesitate. Your grandfather's journal mentions that it appeared to him as his dead comrades from the war, trying to convince him that binding it was a betrayal of their sacrifice." "What does it show you?" Isabelle was quiet for a long moment, her fingers working the ritual rope with practiced precision. "My grandmother usually, telling me I've failed her, that I'm not strong enough to carry on the family legacy. Sometimes it shows me the life I might have had if I'd never accepted the binding. Children, a husband who didn't have to risk his soul fighting ancient evil." As evening approached, they made their way to the sacred spring that served as the hunger's primary lair. The location was hidden deep in a mountain canyon, accessible only through a narrow trail that wound between towering rock formations. Ancient symbols were carved into the stone walls, not the protective marks around Isabelle's cabin, but older signs that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The spring itself was beautiful in a terrible way. Crystal-clear water bubbled up from unknown depths, forming a pool perhaps 20 feet across. But the water was far too warm for a mountain spring, and it moved with currents that had nothing to do with natural flow patterns. Worse, faces seemed to swim just beneath the surface, the features of people who had been consumed by the hunger over the centuries. "It's weaker during daylight," Isabelle explained, though she kept her voice to a whisper. "The entity draws power from darkness, from the fears that multiply when people can't see clearly. But at night, as if summoned by her words, the water began to roil and bubble more violently. The temperature around the spring dropped perceptibly. and both Henry and Isabelle could hear the familiar humming sound rising from the depths. "It knows we're here," Henry said, drawing the blessed saber. The blade immediately blazed with silver light, causing the faces in the water to retreat to deeper levels. "We should go back to the cabin," Isabelle said. "Finish our preparations. Wait for the right moment." But as they turned to leave, they found their path blocked. Sheriff Coleman stood at the canyon entrance, but something was wrong with his posture, his expression. His eyes held the same empty quality they'd seen in the possessed townspeople. "Going somewhere?" Coleman asked, his voice carrying those unnatural harmonics that marked the hunger's influence. Behind him appeared more figures: Pete Morrison, Mrs. Patterson, other townspeople who should have been safe in Cedar Ridge. All bore the signs of supernatural possession, moving with the synchronized precision of puppets controlled by a single intelligence. "It's been busy while we were preparing," Isabelle murmured. "Taking more vessels, building a larger army." The hunger learned from this morning's defeat, Henry realized. Instead of trying to overpower us directly, it's cutting off our escape routes, forcing us to face it here and now. The possessed townspeople began advancing slowly, forming a semicircle that pushed Henry and Isabelle back toward the spring. There was no retreat possible. Behind them lay the bubbling water where the entity waited. Ahead of them stood friends and neighbors whose lives depended on completing the binding ritual without harming the innocent vessels. "Can you do the ceremony here?" Henry asked. "Without proper preparation?" "I have to. It's now or never." Isabelle began unwinding the ritual rope, her hands steady despite the circumstances. "But Henry, the binding requires a willing sacrifice from each bloodline. Your grandfather and my great-grandmother both offered years of their lives to power the original containment. We may need to do the same. How many years?" "Unknown." "The ritual takes what it needs to ensure the binding holds. It could be 5 years, it could be 50. Her eyes met his in the gathering darkness. "Are you willing?" Henry thought of the wooden heart in his pocket, carved by a 6-year-old boy who had promised to marry a mountain woman when he grew up. He thought of the blessed saber that had passed from grandfather to son, carrying with it obligations that transcended personal desire. He thought of the townspeople who stood possessed but not beyond saving, and of all the innocent lives that would be lost if the hunger escaped these mountains. "I made a promise," he said simply. "I intend to keep it." The water in the spring began glowing with its own phosphorescent light, and shapes started rising from the depths. Not faces this time, but forms that hurt to look at directly. The entity was preparing to manifest physically, drawn by the proximity of both bloodlines and the potential for a final, decisive victory. Isabelle began the binding chant in her grandmother's language, her voice carrying clearly through the canyon despite the supernatural winds that had begun swirling around the spring. The ritual rope in her hands started glowing, each strand contributing its own light to an increasingly brilliant weave. The possessed townspeople suddenly rushed forward, moving with inhuman speed. Henry raised the blessed saber and stepped between them and Isabelle, knowing that her concentration must not be broken during the crucial opening phase of the ceremony. "Whatever happens," he called over the rising wind, "don't stop the ritual. No matter what you see, no matter what the entity shows you, keep going." As the first wave of possessed figures reached him, Henry felt the saber's power surge through his body, connecting him not just to the blessed weapon, but to every man in his bloodline who had fought this battle before. The entity was about to learn why the Caldwell family had been chosen as guardians, not just for their courage, but for their absolute refusal to abandon a fight once begun. The ritual binding rope pulsed brighter as Isabelle's chant reached its first crescendo, and from the depths of the spring, something ancient and hungry began its ascent toward the world of light and air. The final confrontation was beginning, and everything depended on their ability to work together, despite the supernatural forces trying to tear them apart. In his pocket, The wooden heart seemed to pulse with its own warmth, a reminder that some promises, made in childhood innocence, could grow into the strength needed to face impossible odds. Tonight, that strength would be tested to its absolute limits. The entity rose from the sacred spring like a nightmare given form, its shape shifting between states of matter, sometimes solid enough to cast shadows, other times translucent as mountain mist. It towered nearly 12 feet tall, its body a writhing mass of darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, where its face should have been. Henry saw instead a void filled with the screaming faces of everyone the hunger had consumed over the centuries. Henry's blessed saber blazed brighter as the creature emerged fully from the water, silver fire dancing along the steel's edge. The possessed townspeople faltered in their advance, caught between the entity's commands and their instinctive fear of the weapon's holy radiance. Behind him, Isabelle's chanting reached a new intensity, the ritual rope in her hands now glowing like captured starlight. Each strand pulsed with different energies, the silver threads blazing white-hot, the wood fibers showing deep green fire, the sacred animal hair shimmering with rainbow colors that had no names. The hunger turned its attention to Henry, and when it spoke, its voice carried the harmonics of everyone it had ever consumed. "The bloodline returns to feed us," it said, the words seeming to come from the canyon walls themselves. Thomas Caldwell's grandson, just as was promised. "I'm not here to feed you," Henry replied, raising the saber. "I'm here to finish what my grandfather started." The entity laughed, a sound like wind through dead trees. "Your grandfather was weak. He bound us with half measures, temporary solutions. When we are free, we will show you what his mercy has cost the world." It gestured toward the possessed townspeople, and they resumed their advance with renewed vigor. But instead of attacking Henry directly, they spread out to surround Isabelle, threatening to break her concentration at the most crucial moment of the ritual. Henry spun and cut through their ranks with the blessed saber, each strike severing the supernatural connections without harming the innocent vessels. Sheriff Coleman collapsed, gasping, as his own consciousness returned. Pete Morrison fell to his knees, confused but alive. One by one, the possessed townspeople were freed from the entity's control, but the effort cost Henry precious strength, and the hunger sensed his momentary weakness. Tendrils of living shadow lashed out from its form, wrapping around Henry's sword arm and burning like acid where they touched flesh. "You cannot fight us with steel alone," the entity hissed. "We are older than your weapons, older than your bloodline's pride." The tendrils tightened, trying to force Henry to drop the saber. But instead of resisting, he stepped closer to the creature, letting the shadows pull him within reach of its central mass. "Maybe not with steel alone," Henry admitted, then grabbed the entity's writhing form with his free hand. The moment flesh made contact with the ancient evil, Henry felt the hunger's true nature, centuries of accumulated malice, an endless appetite that could never be satisfied. The screaming voices of everyone it had consumed, still conscious within its form. The experience threatened to overwhelm his sanity, but he held on, knowing that Isabelle needed this direct contact to complete the binding. The ritual rope in Isabelle's hands erupted with brilliant light as her chanting reached its crescendo. She began weaving the blessed strands around both Henry and the entity, creating patterns that existed in more dimensions than human sight could follow. Each loop of the rope sent waves of purifying energy through the creature's form, causing it to shriek with voices both ancient and newly taken. "The binding is working," Isabelle called out, though the strain of channeling such power was visible in her face. "But I need more time to make it permanent." The entity fought back with desperate fury, its form expanding and contracting as it tried to break free from both Henry's grasp and the encroaching rope. Visions assaulted Henry's mind, his father dying alone, Isabelle consumed by the very evil she was trying to bind, Cedar Ridge destroyed and its people fleeing in terror. "Lies," Henry said through gritted teeth. "These are lies, are they?" The hunger whispered directly into his thoughts. "Your father died calling your name, wondering why his son never came home. Isabelle will sacrifice everything for duty, just as her ancestors did. And when this is over, you will be alone again, bound to guard an empty mountain while life passes you by." For a moment, Henry's grip wavered. The visions felt so real, so devastating in their emotional impact. But then he felt the wooden heart in his pocket, still warm after 17 years, and remembered the promise that had brought him here. "Even if that's true," he said aloud, "some promises are worth keeping." The ritual rope completed its first circuit around both man and monster, and Henry felt the binding begin to take hold. The entity's struggles became more frantic, but each movement only tightened the sacred bonds. Soon it would be contained permanently, unable to threaten Cedar Ridge or any other community. But the cost was becoming clear. With each strand of rope that secured the creature, Henry felt his own life force being drawn into the binding. Just as his grandfather's had been 60 years earlier, the binding ritual reached its crucial second phase as Isabelle wove the sacred rope tighter around Henry and the writhing entity. With each completed loop, the creature's form became more solid, more defined, as if the rope was forcing it to abandon its shape-shifting nature and take a single, vulnerable form. At the center of the entity's mass, something began to crystallize, a hard geometric shape that pulsed with malevolent light. As more of the creature's essence was drawn into this central core, Henry realized what he was seeing. "The heart," he gasped, his voice strained from maintaining contact with the ancient evil. "It's forming a physical heart." Isabelle saw it too, a crystalline structure roughly the size of a man's fist, faceted like a dark gem but pulsing with the rhythm of a living organ. The entity's true essence was being compressed into this single point, making it both more vulnerable and more dangerous than ever before. "The rope is working," she called out, though sweat beaded her forehead from the enormous effort of channeling the binding power. "But Henry, once the heart fully forms, you have to destroy it immediately. If the creature realizes what's happening..." The hunger's scream cut her off, a sound of pure rage that echoed off the canyon walls and sent loose rocks tumbling from the heights above. The entity had indeed realized what was happening, and it began fighting the binding with renewed desperation. Tendrils of shadow lashed out from its form, no longer trying to drain Henry's strength, but attempting to sever the ritual rope before the binding could be completed. Several strands parted under the assault, their blessed light winking out as they fell to the ground. "The rope won't hold much longer," Isabelle shouted over the creature's howling. "Whatever you're going to do, do it now." Henry drew the blessed saber with his free hand while maintaining his grip on the entity with the other. The blade's silver fire blazed brighter than ever, responding to the proximity of ancient evil and the desperate need to end its threat permanently. The crystalline heart pulsed faster as more of the entity's essence was compressed into its faceted surface. Through the translucent material, Henry could see faces swimming, not just the victims from Cedar Ridge, but hundreds of others consumed over the centuries. All of them were still conscious, still suffering, trapped within the creature's core. "I can free them," Henry realized. All of them. Everyone the hunger has ever taken. But destroying the heart would require him to release his grip on the entity, and without that contact, the binding rope would fail. The creature would break free, stronger than ever from having been forced into concentrated form. "Isabelle," he called. "When I let go, how long before the binding fails completely?" "Seconds, maybe less." She completed another loop of the rope, but Henry could see more strands beginning to fray under the entity's assault. "Why?" "Because I'm going to need you to hold it just long enough." Without explaining further, Henry released his grip on the entity and raised the blessed saber high above his head. The moment he broke contact, the ritual rope began unraveling, its glow fading as the binding lost its anchor point. But Isabelle stepped forward and pressed her hand against the creature's writhing form, taking Henry's place as the ritual focus. The medallion around her throat blazed like a small sun, channeling the combined power of both bloodlines through her body alone. The strain was enormous, far more than any single guardian was meant to bear. Blood began trickling from her nose, and her legs shook with the effort of containing the ancient evil through willpower alone. "Now, Henry," she gasped. "Before I—" Henry brought the saber down with all his remaining strength, driving the blessed steel directly into the entity's crystalline heart. The moment the blade made contact, the entire canyon filled with silver fire. The trapped souls within the heart erupted outward like freed birds, their essence streaming up toward the stars as they finally found release from centuries of torment. The entity's death scream shattered the night, a sound that seemed to go on forever before finally fading to silence. Its form collapsed in on itself, dissolving into ordinary shadow that dispersed in the mountain wind. As the silver fire faded, Henry caught Isabelle as she fell, the enormous strain of channeling both bloodlines' power having pushed her to the very edge of collapse. The medallion around her throat had gone dark, its ancient energies finally exhausted after generations of faithful service. Around them, the possessed townspeople were stirring, their own consciousness returning as the entity's influence died with its physical form. Sheriff Coleman was the first to sit up, looking around the canyon with confusion but clear, uncompromised eyes. "Is it over?" he asked. Henry looked at the place where the sacred spring had bubbled for centuries, now just an ordinary pool of mountain water reflecting the stars. The oppressive presence that had hung over these mountains like a curse was gone, leaving behind only clean air and the natural sounds of night in the wilderness. "It's over," he confirmed, helping Isabelle to her feet. "The hunger is destroyed, and everyone it took has been freed." But even as he said the words, Henry wondered about the cost. The binding had required enormous sacrifice from both bloodlines, and he could feel the years that had been drawn from his life to power the ritual. How many remained to him? And what kind of future could he and Isabelle build in the shadow of such sacrifice? The wooden heart in his pocket had gone cold, its purpose finally fulfilled after 17 years of faithful service. 3 months after the defeat of the hunger, Cedar Ridge was beginning to remember what prosperity felt like. The missing townspeople had recovered completely, with no memory of their time as the entity's vessels. The mine had reopened under new management, and families who had fled during the crisis were returning to rebuild their lives. Henry stood at the window of the boarding house, watching the activity in the street below. Mrs. Patterson had finally stopped jumping at shadows, and Pete Morrison was telling anyone who'd listen about the night they'd all helped save the town from ancient evil, though his version grew more dramatic with each telling. The physical changes in Henry were subtle but noticeable to those who knew what to look for. His hair showed more gray than it had 3 months ago, and lines had appeared around his eyes that spoke to years compressed into moments. The binding ritual had indeed claimed part of his lifespan, just as it had taken from his grandfather decades earlier, but he was alive, whole, and free to make his own choices for the first time since childhood. The supernatural obligation that had called him back to Cedar Ridge was fulfilled. He could leave these mountains, return to his previous life, or strike out for new territory entirely. The question was, what did he want? A knock at his door interrupted his contemplation. Sheriff Coleman entered, carrying a small leather pouch that clinked softly with each step. "Morning, Henry. Got something here that belongs to you." Coleman opened the pouch and poured its contents onto the room's small table. Fragments of blessed steel caught the morning light, pieces of his father's cavalry saber, shattered when he'd driven it through the entity's crystalline heart. "Doc Henley and I collected every piece we could find at the spring," Coleman explained. "Thought you might want them, even if the blade can't be repaired." Henry picked up the largest fragment, still feeling traces of the blessing that had made the weapon effective against supernatural evil. "Thank you, Sheriff. This means more than you know. There's something else." Coleman produced a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Letter from the territorial governor delivered this morning by special courier." Henry read the document with growing amazement. The governor was offering him a position as a federal marshal, with special jurisdiction over supernatural threats throughout the Colorado Territory. Apparently, word of the events at Cedar Ridge had reached certain government officials who remembered the old cavalry units that had dealt with similar problems during the Indian Wars. They're reforming the special divisions? Henry asked, quietly and not officially, but yes. Seems there are other places, other communities dealing with things that regular law enforcement can't handle. Coleman sat in the room's single chair. It's good work, important work. And the pay's better than most marshals see. Henry set the letter aside. I'll think about it. Of course, taking a job like that would mean leaving Cedar Ridge, traveling most of the year, never settling down in one place for long. Coleman's weathered face showed a slight smile. Might not be the best choice for a man planning to get married. Before Henry could respond, another knock came at the door. This time it was Isabelle, wearing a dress he'd never seen before, simple but elegant, the deep blue fabric bringing out the color of her eyes. "Sheriff," she said with a nod. "Henry, I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just discussing Henry's future prospects," Coleman replied, rising from his chair. "I'll leave you two to talk." After the sheriff left, Isabelle moved to the window where Henry had been standing. She looked healthier than she had in years. The burden of constant vigilance finally lifted from her shoulders. Like Henry, she showed signs of the ritual's cost. A streak of premature white in her dark hair, a slight fragility that hadn't been there before. But her eyes held peace for the first time since he'd known her. "The federal marshal position?" she asked, having apparently overheard part of the conversation. "They want someone to handle supernatural threats throughout the territory." Henry joined her at the window. "It would mean traveling constantly, facing dangers we can barely imagine, and never having a normal life." "No, never that." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the townspeople go about their daily business in the street below. These were good people who deserved to live without fear, to raise their children in safety, to build something lasting in this harsh but beautiful country. "I've been thinking about promises," Isabelle said eventually, "about the ones we make as children and the ones we make as adults. And a 6-year-old boy once promised to marry me when he grew up. He kept that promise, even when it nearly cost him his life." She turned to face him. "Now I'd like to make a promise of my own." From her dress pocket, she withdrew something that made Henry's breath catch. A ring crafted from metal that gleamed with familiar silver fire. The band was forged from fragments of his father's blessed saber, worked by skilled hands into something both beautiful and powerful. "Isabelle, I promise to stand beside you whatever path you choose," she continued. "Whether that's staying in Cedar Ridge as the town healer and the retired gunfighter, or traveling the territory as federal marshals dealing with threats that others can't face. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Henry took the ring, feeling the warmth of the blessed metal and the love that had shaped it into this new form. "You'd be willing to leave these mountains? After everything you've sacrificed to protect them? The mountains don't need a guardian anymore. The hunger is gone and the old bindings are broken." She smiled with genuine happiness. "For the first time in 17 years, I'm free to choose my own destiny. And I choose you." The ring fit perfectly on his finger, the blessed metal seeming to recognize its proper place. In that moment, Henry understood that some promises were meant to evolve, to grow from childhood dreams into adult choices made with full knowledge of their cost. "Then I guess we'd better start planning a wedding," he said. Outside the window, Cedar Ridge continued its daily life under the broad Colorado sky. Soon, the church bells would ring to celebrate the union of two people who had found love in the shadow of ancient evil and chosen to build something new from the ashes of old obligations. The wooden heart in Henry's pocket had served its purpose, but the promise it represented would continue in new forms, in wedding vows spoken before their community, in the work they would do together to protect others from supernatural threats, and in the children who would someday carry on their legacy of courage and love. Some promises, Henry reflected as he held Isabelle close, were worth keeping forever.